I pledge you that we shall neither commit nor provoke aggression, that we shall neither flee nor invoke the threat of force, that we shall never negotiate out of fear, and we shall never fear to negotiate.
During the predicament of the Cuban Missile Crisis, shortly after the Cold War in October of 1962, the U.S. discovered that the Soviet Union had supplied Cuba with nuclear weapons designated to attack the United States. To counter this action, President Kennedy assembled a group known as ExComm, which consisted of government officials of all branches. ExComm convened to advise the president during the situation, and they further debated possible solutions in order to peacefully resolve the Cuban Missile Crisis. After many careful debates, it was decided that the Cuban blockade was the best solution to de-escalate the crisis. This decision to enforce coercive diplomacy immediately prevented additional supplies from reaching Cuba. This eventually led to the end of nuclear warfare tensions, along with the overall resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which illustrated the effectiveness of coercive diplomacy. The detonation of the first atomic weapons by the United States and Japan led to the beginning of the nuclear arms race and the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union immediately began work to expand their nuclear stockpiles and compete against one another and their allies for supremacy in nuclear power. From the years of 1945 to 1963, the United States had accumulated a nuclear arsenal of approximately 5,000 warheads, while the Soviet Union only had 300 warheads. Dwight D. Eisenhower was President of the United States during this time. He expressed concern after realizing that nuclear construction was quickly getting out of hand. He wrote in the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty that mankind approaches a state where mutual annihilation becomes a possibility. Once Fidel Castro was elected Prime Minister of Cuba in 1959, Cuba's relationship with the United States declined and trade decreased substantially. In the journal article, Soviet Economic Aid to Cuba, Robert Walter states that Castro nationalized all foreign assets in Cuba, hiked taxes on U.S. imports, and established trade deals with the Soviet Union. Castro's interest in the Soviet Union became very concerning to the United States and made President Eisenhower feel the need to take action against Castro and his supporters.
In March of 1960, Eisenhower ordered the CIA to train and arm the Cuban Exile Forces and help them prepare for an attack on Castro and his troops. In November of 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected President of the United States and was briefed on the attack plan. Kennedy trusted the CIA and Joint Chiefs of Staff since they had already been working on an invasion plan, but he was determined to disguise U.S. support.
However, after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in April of 1961, Kennedy was humiliated, and it was noted by Robert Kennedy in his book, 13 Days, that the Bay of Pigs had taught the president to distrust the Joint Chiefs of Staff. On October 14, 1962, a U-2 spy plane collected photographic proof that the Soviets had installed nuclear weapons in Cuba aimed to attack the United States. These photos started the Cuban Missile Crisis, which eventually became the hottest point of the Cold War. Looking at the U-2 spy plane photos, U.S. analysts were able to determine that the USSR had sites for medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic nuclear missiles that were under construction in Cuba. Since President Kennedy was ashamed of what he had let happen at the Bay of Pigs invasion, he decided to take control of the crisis and create a new National Security Committee. This group became known as ExComm, which was an acronym for the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. There were 16 core members of ExComm, with the most prominent being President Kennedy, Robert McNamara, Robert Kennedy, John McCone, General Maxwell Taylor, and George Ball. The first time members of ExComm assembled was on Tuesday, October 16th, where they discussed the U-2 spy plane photos and started the debate on a course of action to take. While a variety of opinions arose within the meetings, two main solutions exceeded the others, that being the naval blockade and the decision to launch an air attack.
It was on that Tuesday afternoon when the ideas for a blockade and air attack were created. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara was the blockade's strongest advocate, and he argued that it was limited force, which could be increased as the circumstances warranted. The blockade was a show of dramatic and forceful pressure, which would send a message to the Soviet Union, yet more importantly, leave the U.S. in control of events to come.
While many members supported the blockade approach, others and the Joint Chiefs of Staff were unanimous in calling for immediate military action. Since World War II had only ended 17 years prior to the Cuban Missile Crisis, many military government officials considered nuclear weapons as an easy and efficient way to stop our enemies and prevent war with just the push of a button. General Curtis LeMay, Air Force Chiefs of Staff, and Marine Corps Commandant David Shoup, who were present for several ExComm meetings, argued strongly with the president that a military attack was essential and that the blockade would not be effective. They felt that the blockade would bring about a confrontation with the Soviet Union by stopping their ships while not actually stopping the construction of the missiles already in Cuba. The Joint Chiefs of Staff airstrike plan consisted of launching 500 missiles, striking all military targets, including the missile sites, airfield, port, and gun emplacements. They believed that a massive display of U.S. strength would force the Soviets into capitulation.
However, their opposition and Attorney General Robert Kennedy pointed out that the blockade had more flexibility and fewer liabilities than a military attack. The strongest argument against the air attack was that it would erode, if not destroy, the moral position of the United States throughout the world. This would cause the U.S. to lose control of the situation and could possibly end up sparking a nuclear war that would leave no one around at the end to ever know who won.
After 4 intense days filled with meetings, briefings, and debates, ExComm members were stressed and fatigued. Robert Kennedy recalls in his book, 13 Days, each one of us was being asked to make a recommendation which would affect the future of all mankind, a recommendation which, if wrong and if accepted, could mean the destruction of the human race. On Friday, October 19th, a procedure was agreed upon to try and give some intelligent solutions to the president. Members of ExComm split into 2 groups, each in favor of a different solution to the crisis. They then wrote up their respective recommendations, exchanged papers to dissect and criticize the other, then returned the papers to their original groups to develop further answers. This process allowed ExComm to decide which solution would be the most effective, would keep U.S. citizens safe, would be supported by our allies in the UN, and would minimize Soviet retaliation to leave the U.S. in control of events to come. The group that advocated immediate military action was led by the Joint Chiefs of Staff along with John McCone, chief of the CIA. Their outline consisted of the areas to be attacked, how we would defend our choice to the UN, how we could possibly obtain support from Latin American countries, and a threatening letter to Khrushchev about the Soviets positioning militarily against us in the Caribbean. The group that advocated for the blockade was led by Robert McNamara, Robert Kennedy, and presidential advisor Theodore Sorensen. They outlined the legal basis for their action, an agenda for a meeting with the UN, and the militarily procedures for stopping ships where force might be used if necessary.
On Saturday morning, October 20th, both recommendations were finalized and were presented to the president for the last time. It was now up to one single man. No committee was going to make this decision. Overlooking these 2 outlines, the president realized that to keep his citizens safe and minimize Soviet retaliation, leave the U.S. with the upper hand, the blockade was the best solution. He also realized that supporting the naval blockade would help to buy time to negotiate a missile withdrawal.
However, the decision to launch an air attack most likely would have ignited the Soviets' desire for revenge and possibly have started a nuclear world war. According to a historical article written by Patrick J. Kigger, JFK and his advisors are careful to call it a quarantine because a blockade is considered an act of war. On Monday, October 22nd at 7 p.m., Kennedy addressed the nation and informed them of the nuclear missiles in Cuba and what the United States was going to do in response.
To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
Kennedy's use of coercive diplomacy, with the enactment of the Cuban quarantine, proved to be highly effective during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The quarantine immediately stopped the shipments of all nuclear weapons to Cuba and forced the Soviets into missile withdrawal negotiations. These discussions later led to the removal of these nuclear weapons in Cuba, in turn resolving the Cuban Missile Crisis and preventing the start of a nuclear world war. Since Kennedy's quarantine, the United States has made it clear that we will not tolerate the Soviets ever trying to position militarily against us in North or South America. Kennedy's action also ended up influencing future presidents by giving them a new perspective of diplomacy. However, since coercive diplomacy was used in the form of Kennedy's quarantine, subsequent attempts at using this diplomacy have failed. Coercive diplomacy relies on intimidation and threatening your enemy with a great show of force while actually only using limited force. But as technology has advanced and the world has modernized, coercive diplomacy has become less effective because the world itself has become more interconnected. An example of this happening was the Bush administration's efforts to force Saddam to end his occupation of Kuwait in 1990. The US and the UN used economic sanctions to try and force Saddam to withdraw from Kuwait. These failed, leading to the 1991 Gulf War. The United States' use of coercive diplomacy since Kennedy's presidency has not been able to provide the desired outcomes. However, under Kennedy, the choice to enact Cuban quarantine by ExComm successfully accomplished the president's goal to avoid potential nuclear warfare, and ended up leading to the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis.